So we're stepping into a new time period. So this for us, the way that we work through U.S. history this year, this is period 3. And period 3 begins with the beginning of the French and Indian War, or if you're a global historian, the beginning of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War that took 9 years, right? If you are looking at where we end with the election of 1824, which gives us Jacksonian democracy, okay? And really we also make that dividing line because we see the first industrial revolution beginning. We also see the beginning of Native American removal shortly thereafter, the growth of the Cotton Kingdom into the West. In other words, 1824 fits to be a nice dividing line in American history for us to give us what we think of as period 3, okay? So with this period, let's think about this for just a moment. 70 years of American history, and let's think about some of the things that happened during this period. So the French and Indian War, which leads to the American Revolution. We have the development of the American constitutional system in the 1780s and the development of the Constitution and Bill of Rights in the early 1790s. Our first presidential administrations under the Federalists with Washington and John Adams. Our first 2 political parties developed during this period, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, or we're going to call them the Jeffersonian Republicans, right? One of the things that I end up doing after the lecturing over the first period is students almost always ask, can you give us a history of the political parties, usually every year, right? And this is the first time that we have a 2-party system with the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Remember, the Federalist Party actually disappears by the end of this period, and there's only one party. But the party after the election of 1824, after Jackson's elected in 1828, by 1832, people like Henry Clay, for example, who oppose Andrew Jackson and others, John C. Calhoun included, they're going to be people who actually become Whigs during this period. Daniel Webster, for example, who oppose Andrew Jackson. And so Jackson actually, the party drops the name of Jeffersonian Republican or Democratic Republican. They drop the word Republican, they drop the word Jeffersonian, and they simply call themselves Democrats, right? Because they're the party of democracy by 1824. They're the party of the white working class voter, because I did not put this up here under politics because it goes with the next period. And of course, that's universal white male suffrage, right? And that's what's going to change the dynamic for the Democratic Party throughout the course of the 19th and into the first half of the 20th century to an extent, to the 1920s, okay, after World War I. Also, we have to think about it for a moment. After Jefferson's election, America becomes involved under President James Madison. During Jefferson's presidency, we actually double the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. America begins moving westward for the very first time in people in large numbers. Native Americans and conflicts that occurred throughout the 1790s. Immigration still occurring in America during this period. But the War of 1812 is a major event which changes really, I think, the calculus at the end of this period and the trajectory of the country leading up to the period that we just finished on Friday that will eventually culminate in giving us the Civil War, first half of that period. Just like what we just saw a moment ago, I think the second half of that period from 1861 to 1890 really gives you the modern America of the 20th century, not just by timeline, but by what happens in terms of the growth of American industry during it. So what we're stepping back to right now is the growth, roots of the American political system during this period. That's why on almost every case, whenever we stepped up here in the beginning, we saw a lot under the category of America and the world. I actually put American identity and society together during this period and during any other. Technology, there's not a lot of technological growth during this period, but the technologies are critical to understand that are developed during this period. Americans during this period are on the move for the first time, with the exception of African slaves during this period. Yes, they're on the move during this time, but they're on the move because of the growth of the institution itself. We actually abolished the slave trade in 1808, but throughout this period, slaves are being imported from West Africa into the young United States. Okay? The environment is characterized during this period by this movement into the West for the first time. Cities are growing in America's port areas for the first time. Economics gave us the American Revolution. Economic crises give us Shays' Rebellion, which give us the Constitution. Our first issue over the power and how much of it the federal government should have is actually in the hands of this period with Hamiltonian economics and policies, right? And of course, we'll buy more territory during this period. That'll facilitate the growth of a market economy by the end of the period. And of course, America faces its first major recession since the 1780s during this period, okay? I am going to add something here under politics and power. And I know it's going to sound odd whenever you see it. Conservatism. I know. We don't think of conservatism until, unfortunately, until the 1950s, but there's always been conservatism in American politics, right? And I think that Jeffersonian democracy is the place where we actually see that first, okay? So let's step into this for just a moment. And remember, we're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth as we go throughout the period, but so we actually begin the period by time by looking at the French and Indian War. In 1754, the 13 colonies, of course, are owned by or are part of the British Empire, owned by the British government, right? As those colonies sought to expand into the West, as their populations grew, why is this happening? From 1700 to 1750, there's a tremendous influx of immigrants coming into North America. Why are these immigrants coming? They're coming for one reason principally. They're coming for land, right? Most of the immigrants who come here are farmers by trade. Many of the immigrants, however, who come here are also criminals and people of ill repute in the countries that they're leaving behind. Some are leaving because of religious or political persecution, right? Some are coming here as indentured servants, not of their own free will, right? But with the opportunity to have their freedom at the end of their indenture or service contract period, right? We also have to factor in something else, right? France owns the Mississippi River Valley during this period, or they claim to own it, right? The French have a good relationship with the Native Americans that are living in this part of the North American continent because they're dependent upon them for items such as fur in the fur trade, okay? So there's a competition for North America by 1754 between the British Empire on the one hand and New France or the French Empire in North America on the other. The Spanish also owned the American Southwest during this period, a large chunk of what would be in the east, Texas, all the way to the Pacific coast, with California being a part of the Spanish Empire during this period as well, okay? Florida is also a part of the Spanish Empire during this time. The French own the territory, as we would if we were looking at a map, in between Florida and Texas, okay? So both the French and the Spanish have access to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The British own islands in the Caribbean during this period, but the British are mostly, their largest possessions by geographical area, of course, are the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard. But because of immigration, right, those colonies are growing. As they grow into the West, there's tension between those new colonists and the Native Americans. That tension by 1754 erupts into war, okay? Now, we're not going to spend just a ton of time on the French and Indian War itself, right? But what we do need to spend a lot of time on are the results of that war. The French and Indian War was costly to both the French government, which we're going to see lead to a French Revolution later, and it's costly to the British Empire as well. Why? If you're a global historian, you refer to this event usually as the 7 Years' War. It was a global conflict that pitted the two world superpowers against one another in a hot war, okay? By the end of it, both of these countries are in tremendous debt, okay? In the United States, soon to be United States, British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, right? We have to think the Enlightenment, a major intellectual movement during the period, is also occurring among the elite that are living in the 13 colonies during this period. And while this is a social and intellectual movement, this well-educated elite tend to be living in the American colonies in their port cities during this period, right? There is one thing to note when we talk about the development of an American identity during this period. People who live in America's cities and port towns during this period tend to be well-educated, tend to be immigrants, tend to be merchants and shopkeepers. People who live outside of them, the vast majority of the population, tend to be farmers living in the small towns of the colonies, okay, and tend to be worried mostly about issues with the Native Americans, tend to have their own small communities centered around their community church. Probably between the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening that we talk about in tomorrow's unit has more of an effect on the people who are living in rural areas outside of the developing colonial ports during this period. While the Enlightenment has much more of an effect, those ideologies have much more of an effect on the people living in the colonial towns and port cities during this period. When the French and Indian War ends, what happens is this, right? So the British government, wanting to prevent another conflict in 1763, draws what is called the Proclamation Boundary Line Act of 1763. What does that mean? That means that they're trying to restrict colonists from moving into the West, right? Which caused conflicts with the French and with the Native Americans. Why? The British do not want to continue the process of footing the bill for defending American colonists against Native American attacks. So rather than, for example, facilitating the growth of forts or sending British troops, which was quite expensive to do, 3,000 miles away from the British Isles, they simply relied upon a law, right, or a policy that the colonists could not disobey. This idea, right, that you could not move beyond this particular boundary line, which today would be the chain of the Appalachian Mountains running from what is New York State today all the way into what would be northern Georgia, okay? But the British government, because they are in debt during this period, have two phenomena at work, okay? So politically, what's interesting for us whenever we look at, and we're gonna look at three different things happening at the same time, okay? So the causes of the American Revolution, right? We're going to tie that to the economics that give you the American Revolution. But we're also going to tie it to something else that's the hidden element for Americans being able to win the American Revolution, right? So we need to think about these three elements working in concert with one another. First of all, the British government by 1763 had made a lot of enemies within its own borders, right? Their subjugation of the Irish, the harsh repression of the people of Scotland to their north. This made significant enemies of groups of people who ultimately become immigrants moving into the American colonies during the years in between the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1754 and the beginning of the American Revolution. During those 2 decades, people who hated the British Empire or came to hate it, right? Even though they were citizens as a part of it, right? Oppressed essentially within it, move into the American colonies in large numbers during this period. And where do they move? Well, they move into what we call the colonial backcountry, right? They move along that frontier boundary line. They move into areas looking for land to create their own small farms. Again, they're heavily influenced by the churches in their communities, and they tend to be homogeneous communities. but they also tend to have what in common? A deep suspicion and sometimes an outright hatred for all things British. So while this movement is occurring, something else is occurring. The British government is still heavily in debt, right? So in order to deal with that debt, the British government creates a series of taxation measures, okay? I'm just going to go through the list, right? First, in 1764, there's the Sugar Act. In 1765, there's the Stamp Act, which is repealed by the Declaratory Act in 1766. In 1767, there are the Townshend Acts. In 1769, after an act in 1765 that had begun the process, we refer to it as the Quartering Act, of making colonists living in port cities house British troops, right? We see the Boston Massacre of 1770. By 1773, we see the Tea Act, and with the Tea Act, of course, we see the Boston Tea Party, probably one of the great protests of the period. Now, why do the taxation measures create such a rebellion in the American colonies? Two reasons, okay? The first is this. There's this age-old idea, and it's somewhat true, right, about the policy of salutary neglect. In the 1660s, the British government, in fact, at the end of the English Civil War, the British government had begun applying what were called the Navigation Acts. This is a system of mercantilism. Products created in the colonies, raw materials harvested in the colonies would only go to Great Britain, right? And so therefore, Great Britain controlled colonial markets. If you're the colonists, during this period off and on, you're also smuggling goods to Dutch traders, for example, French traders, for example, Spanish traders, for example. Why are you doing these things? Because you can make more money, okay? When the British government needs money beginning in the mid-1760s, they begin to clamp down on some of these activities. The other thing is this, the activities themselves, right? The colonists also have a political reason. That's called virtual representation. The colonists feel like their interests are not represented fairly in the British government because they have no representative in Parliament. Ultimately, from 1765 to roughly 1770, we begin to see a shift in their line of thinking, such that by 1774, they're actually appealing to the British Crown. Now, why does this shift occur? It occurs because of this. The idea of virtual representation means that the king is representative of every subject living in the British Empire. So in the beginning, if we look at the documents, if we look at the taxation measures, and we look at why Americans are protesting leading up to the American Revolution, it's always because of acts that are created by Parliament. The problem is that by the end of this, the colonists begin the process of the realization of understanding. This is an authoritarian regime, right, to some extent, under King George III, who wields tremendous power. And so therefore, he is their representative that they should be appealing to. And whenever they cannot appeal to him, right, as we will see here in a moment, that's when the Revolutionary War actually begins. Something else that the taxation measures actually do as well, that's very important. Beginning with the Stamp Act of 1765, what we see are organizations that are dedicated and created specifically for the purpose of protesting each of these acts by the British government. In other words, we see not just a political resistance, but we see political organizations that are being created to create resistance to these acts of taxation, right? Principal among them, for example, the Sons of Liberty. Another phenomena that we see occurring from 1765 to roughly 1775, or the beginning of the Revolution, is that the majority of the incidents occur in the environs around one particular port city, and that's the port city of Boston. After the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and remember, this is December 1773, so we're easily stepping into the next year of 1774. For the very first time, the colonists begin to band together because they see their interests to be more alike with those of the struggles of the city of the people, of the city of Boston and of the colony of Massachusetts, where all of the protests, all of the events, and all of the issues with the British government have been occurring throughout this period of almost a decade by 1774. And so for the first time, the colonists create a political organization, and we refer to that, of course, as the First Continental Congress. In 1774, it's also coincidental, right, that the British government also issues what are called the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts, right? Closing the port city of Boston, closing off or shutting off trade, becoming much more restrictive in how they collect taxation, applying measures where there's a military occupation in the port city of Boston. All of these are on the minds of the people that meet in the Continental Congress, delegates that come from each of the 13 colonies by 1774. In other words, it looks like war's brewing by 1774. And so it's in early 1775, having had enough of the British occupation of the city of Boston, that by April of that year, we begin to see the first shots fired in the American Revolution. The other thing that we have to understand is this: the colonists of the First Continental Congress have drafted two people. Now, these two individuals are no strangers to us. One is a young Thomas Jefferson, and the other is John Dickinson. In 1768, to protest the Townshend Acts, John Dickinson had wrote letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. Let's backtrack for just a second, right? Even in 1775, when the first shots of the American Revolution are fired, there are two different camps in the American colonies. People who want to go to immediate war with the British government by the spring of 1775, and people are still willing to work out some sort of compromise with the British government, some sort of type of home rule like what will be given later, for example, to Australia and Canada, New Zealand, okay? That never happens, right? What John Dickinson in early 1775 and Thomas Jefferson draft for the Second Continental Congress is what we refer to as the Olive Branch Petition. In other words, a series of compromises with King George III that could have averted the American Revolution. The only problem is that by the time King George III, because everything travels by ship across the Atlantic Ocean, by the time King George III actually receives the Olive Branch Petition, the first great battle of the American Revolution between the colonists and the British troops occupying the city of Boston has been fought outside on the hills surrounding the city of Boston. Though fought on Breed's Hill, this battle at Bunker Hill was incredibly bloody, and it really demonstrated two things. The first was that the American Revolution would have to be put down by force. Second, it demonstrated that the colonists had the ability to defeat the British Army on its own terms. And so this is where we really mark, for all intents and purposes, wars already began, but we really mark the conflict as entering into a more determinate phase after the Battle of Bunker Hill.